So I'll introduce myself first, and I'll talk you through the panel. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about ESSA, because we've touched on ESSA a little bit without really explaining a lot about what we're actually doing. So my name is Ben Wells. I run my own business called Well Said. I feel for a lot of the guys here in the football club side. I've worked football side most of my life. I used to run marketing and sponsorship at Chelsea. I've been the commercial director at Reading. So interesting stuff there from Toby. This session is entitled, Is Official Dead? And by that, we're asking the question about whether the traditional sponsorship model needs a rethink. In November the 18th, at the Royal College of Medicine, we are running the 3rd annual ESSA Sponsorship Summit. If you are not already aware of it, then I suggest you have a look at sponsorship.org, which is the ESSA website. We'd love to have you there. We're exploring a whole bunch of different themes, looking at how traditional business models have been disrupted by changing consumer behavior, by changing technology, and asking in a full day session how we think that's going to affect the traditional sponsorship model. So that's me. I'm also a board director at the European Sponsorship Association. I'm delighted here in this session where we're going to be a little bit of a teaser for the Sponsorship Summit itself. Be joined by Joel Seymour Hyde, who is the Vice President of Strategy for Octagon EMEI, India.
Yes,
very
well,
good.
Yeah.
Jackie Fast, who's the Managing Director and also Board Director of ESSA of Slingshot Sponsorship, and Chris Maples from Copa90, which is a branded content platform. So when we talk about the traditional sponsorship model, we're talking about a lot about what's been discussed, certainly in Toby's session, and it was actually quite good to hear a lot of the guys from the brand side talking about data and engagement and what have you. When we talk about the traditional sponsorship model, what do we think of, Joel?
I think, well, hello everyone. I think it's probably a lot of what the guys in the previous session talked about. So the classic sort of inventory of tickets, hospitality, signage, a bit of a website branding, and so on and so forth. So I think the guys mentioned they're kind of used to that traditional package that they would receive and be proposed around, and that's, I think, what people understand by traditional model. Yeah.
Okay. And Jackie, for you, what is the role of sponsorship in the marketing mix? I mean, we talk about sponsorship. We talked a lot in the first two sessions about sticking names on shirts in return for cash, but is that the only role of sponsorship?
No, obviously. Well, I'd probably say that's probably the last role in sponsorship. But actually, the last two discussions and presentations talked a lot about, sponsorship's now becoming part of marketing. Marketing's really important. Marketing's part of the brand. Actually, sponsorship in this ever-connected world, which has so many messages, is actually quite crucial and actually becoming more vital as part of the marketing mix, and always should have been. Yeah. I think far too often, and forgive me for saying this, but the big football teams of the world are really fixated on, let's throw a logo on a shirt, let's give some people some hospitality, and that's what sponsorship is, when actually sponsorship, like it was mentioned in the last one, is about collaboration, it's about partnership, and when you've got two strong organizations that are going forward on a journey together, actually what you can create is far more substantial than throwing some, I guess, quite antiquated assets at a brand.
Yeah. Chris, do people really care whether you're an official sponsor or not?
I suspect, like lots of questions I'm going to get asked in this panel, I think the answer is probably some do and some don't. I think one thing that I was surprised didn't come out in the previous panel, for those of you that were listening to the previous panel, is I think the most important thing about sponsorship and activating around what you sponsor is this degree of authenticity. There's got to be a reason why you're there. Otherwise, it's a simple cash transaction. And to Jackie's point, in a world that is as connected as it is now, in the past, you go back 20 years, life was a very simpler place, and you could be a shirt sponsor or a stadium sponsor, and it kind of didn't matter because the conversation wasn't really taking place publicly anymore. Now it's conversations constantly publicly through social and various other things. So I think brands that are getting involved in sponsorship, and I think there's absolutely a place for sponsorship, of course I do, but I think you've got to have a reason for being there. You've got to create a story and an authenticity in that space, otherwise why are you there? And if you just simply go and badge something and then don't do nothing with it, then it's a waste of time. We did some research quite recently. So for those of you who don't know, Copper Night's biggest football fan platform in the world, YouTube channels, social channels, and we create content for brands and for our channel itself that tells amazing stories about fans and fan culture. We did some research, really, some very top-line research. Don't read too much into it because I don't have the actual data at my hands, but we asked about 2,000 of our fans which brands mean something to you in football. Now, look at all the brands that are here and all the brands that sponsor football around the world, and 2 brands stood out by a million miles: Adidas and Nike. Now, clearly they are sports brands, right? And they are in that, but they have created a reason to be there as well. They do a ton of stuff in that space that's really interesting. But lots of other brands who spend fortunes in that space just don't activate properly, and I think it gets lost. I'll come on and talk about some stuff we've done with Hyundai, I'm sure, a bit later.
So in the first 2 sessions, we've had the rights holders, the clubs primarily, getting a bit of a kicking, and I think probably from experience we'd say that's probably about right. But if the brands aren't getting it right, what's the incentive to change?
In what way do you mean incentive change for who?
Well, if there, as Chris is saying, there are still enough brands out there who are buying bad sponsorship,
Right.
why should the rights holders change?
Well, I think ultimately because the money will start to go down. So
Yeah.
I think what we are seeing now, and I work a lot with helping brands find sponsorships. So I think Toby talked about it. I'm one of the agencies that people like him will use to help navigate the market and find what you should sponsor. And what we're seeing, even at the top end now, at the sort of even at the UEFA end, and certainly the Premier League as well, is it is actually harder to sell those big ticket items for incremental increases in sponsorship revenue. And the reason for that is quite simple. Essentially, there's a bit of a sort of disconnect now happening between the traditional models we've talked about and what brands want and what rights holders are able to provide them with. So this is fundamentally caused by brands demanding sort of a lot of the content stuff that everyone's talking about more and more. So they want live match footage, they want highlights, they want clips, they want more chances to work with players, all this sort of the cool stuff really. And they don't want to necessarily give up the traditional stuff, but they want all the add-ons, which is kind of what Nathan was talking about. That's the part of the contract that takes the longest to now agree. Problem is the rights holders have sold most of that inventory to broadcasters, and the broadcasters are ultimately, in most cases, more important than the sponsors because the check is infinitely better. So if you're the Premier League, 96% of your revenue is from the broadcasters. There's a limit to how much you really worry about what the sponsors think. And in that environment, then ultimately, if the brands aren't getting what they want and the rights holders won't shift what they'll provide, then the rights holders will need to understand or respect that if that paradigm stays the same, the fees will go down because they won't be able to deliver the added value that the brands want. So it's almost a case of you don't have to necessarily change if you don't want to, but you need to understand, therefore, that will have a knock-on effect to what your ambition commercially should be. So if you want to change, you need to try and find this balance where you can kind of have grown-up conversations with the broadcasters about what they're really using, what they really value, and then what can you take back and give to brands to add value and therefore increase your commercial revenue from that part of your business. And that's kind of the decision you need to make, really.
So I just wanted to add, I'd argue that they don't, really. You know, a lot of football clubs, a lot of properties, especially in sports, they still have brands that are coming to the table with multi-million pounds that aren't actually asking for more than chucking a logo on a shirt. The cost to implement that is like negligible. And so your profit margins for a deal like that is substantial. Whereas if you were to actually talk about all of the great stuff that we want to do, the clever sponsorship, the clever marketing, all of the great social stuff that you can build from content marketing, it takes work, it takes time, it takes clever people, it takes resource. And if you don't want to go through that, you don't do it unless you absolutely have to. And within football and other sports sponsorship, they haven't really hit that critical moment. You're seeing brands start pulling out of stuff and start doing stuff a little bit different, starting to build their own platforms. But you don't see it where we saw it with publishing or music or anything, because it hasn't hit the tipping point yet.
Sure.
Can I just come in on that as well? I think that point is coming, right? I think we all established that. The two biggest marketing, media owner, whatever you want to call them, entities in the world, bar none, didn't exist 15 years ago, right? Google and Facebook. swallowed up huge amounts of marketing budget. No one saw it coming. In fact, the world didn't see Google coming. And then they thought, right, we better right-size our business and figure this out. And then they didn't. And then 3 years later, Facebook came in. No one saw that either. So what those two organisations have brought with them, rightly or wrongly, is a much greater level of data, much greater level of insight, much greater level of understanding. Now, whether you agree with all the metrics or not, sort of makes no difference. They're the sort of metrics that people are measuring impact on. So the world where multi-million pounds are being spent on badging rights is fine, because there are still tons of brands that want to do it, and certainly as markets like Asia and Africa open up, there'll be increasing amounts of brands that will want to get active in that space as well. But sooner or later, the guy who holds the purse strings is going to start comparing the impact of that with the impact of everything else they can do. And if it is a simple badging exercise that's doing nothing else with it, it will stick out like a sore thumb, and they will divert money elsewhere. So are there still brands wanting to do that now? Absolutely, but you know what, just beware those brands that aren't thinking about that, or those entities that aren't thinking about creating assets and creating opportunities and creating integrations that are going to really mean something, because sooner or later someone is going to say that's doing nothing for us and we're going to go.
And the other point of that, actually, that Chris kind of brings up, is that now there's so many more competitors. You know, if you were a football club, you'd be going against other football clubs when you're looking for sponsorship. But now, actually, you have to look at where's the money being spent. Yeah. You're now you're comparing yourself with pay-per-click, Facebook, all of that other stuff. So you have to be smarter.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think, you know, what we've experienced in the last 7 or 8 years, certainly since 2008, is the man in the street is far more discerning about how they spend their time and money. I think we get a real feel on what the value actually constitutes for us. And we have to question, actually, I think, whether the traditional 90 minutes or 80 minutes, if it's rugby, we've got the Rugby World Cup coming up shortly, does that actually stand up as a value proposition? Prices certainly haven't gone down. Or should the clubs and the rights holders more broadly be working more collaboratively, more creatively, more fluidly with brands, and saying, actually, do you know what we need to do is fill our stadium up. We need to make sure that our value proposition is so good that people are not going and spending their time and their money with the things you just talked about, and actually we can't do it on our own. We need to do it with brands, and actually we get to a stage where we have cashless sponsorships, because actually the key is actually making sure people are coming in the first place. And that's particularly, I think, looking at some of the trends we're seeing in youth behaviour.
If I was going to recommend to look at any sort of best practice around the world, it's probably the US market. So the big US sports properties, so the MLB, the NBA, the NFL, these guys, they are actually, despite being huge, big, reasonably traditional platforms, are probably the most innovative at thinking about some of these challenges and how they can increase value for partners without, you know, having to completely replicate the model and actually add loads of value. So, you know, the NFL have been doing great partnerships with Google themselves actually now, so you can have like integrated search in Google. If you search for NFL on Google, your branded content can be seen there. So they're giving their brands value back because they know people are going to Google. The NBA have got some brilliant stuff to do with Twitter Amplify. So if brands are demanding, we want highlights and content, they use Twitter Amplify to put those highlights immediately onto Twitter just after a point scored, and that is sponsored by partners of the NBA. So again, so part of the solution is even not necessarily working the brands, is actually working with these people like Google, like Facebook, like Twitter, the guys where everyone's going, and finding ways to kind of get the content back and control it, and then add value that way. Because I think if you're a rights holder, the thing you're most scared about is people running campaigns around sport without having to use your rights. So just going onto Twitter, running a social campaign, and not having to pay to associate. So not necessarily ambush, but we're getting close to ambush. And if you actually bring these guys in with you, you can do revenue share models, lots of stuff you can do. You can take that control back and actually create better experiences for your consumers, and then you're going to kind of create that value exchange, which means everyone kind of wins, and I think that's the big answer to it.
Chris, I mean, I think you probably agree with this, but I think the traditional linear TV model has disrupted, it's certainly not dead, but it's been hugely disrupted in the last few years. You know, do we see that fragmentation as a threat? I mean, most of the traditional sponsorship model is predicated on a media value, or is it an opportunity? Can we harness changing media consumption, changing technologies to build something a bit richer?
I mean, I think that genie is out the bottle. If you're not, I don't think it's a question of can you do that. It's more questions if you're not doing it, then you're miles behind and and you're going to kind of wither on the vine a little bit. One of the things I think that's really interesting, again, about the previous panel, and even as much as we've talked about now, is that no one is talking about the fans themselves. They're the most important part in this trifecta between brands, rights holders, and the audience, because it's the audience that the brands are aiming to talk to and reach and create a dialogue with or sell something to. And it's those guys who are the quickest to vote with their feet as well. So they totally get, in a world that is connected now, you know, my 7-year-old daughter knows how to operate an iPad and use, you know, various aspects of YouTube and stuff like that better than she knows how to read a book, right? So the whole generation, 3 generations now, have grown up in a connected world. They also understand, far better than anyone of my generation, does, that there is a value exchange between brands and content or experiences or whatever it is. They totally get that football clubs need to have badges on their shirts and stuff like that. They totally understand that. They're relaxed about that, but there has to be a value exchange. You can't just come in. It's one of the things I find difficult with some clubs, that, you know, you can't just come in year one, drop a new logo on my club shirt and then disappear the next year and have added no value. Well, you can, because that does happen. But you haven't created any kind of meaningful relationship. I've got no great reason to use your service or whatever. So I think people need to think about the association and relationship they're trying to build with fans. One of the things that we do, and we are a tiny part of this ecosystem, right? We help create content that helps brands amplify whatever it is they're doing. So the work we did with Hyundai, Hyundai, a major tournament sponsor, Euros, World Cup. Last year they approached us and said, it's the World Cup. We never activate around our World Cup sponsorship. We would like to do something. And so we created a series of films for them where we went over to Brazil. We did a city tour with Hyundai. We did some interviews in the back of cabs. Nothing particularly dramatic. But we also, in part of those films, we took fans on the journey into the favelas in Brazil to show them the soccer academies that were being launched in the favelas. We interviewed people in those soccer academies, realised how important soccer was in Brazil during the time of the World Cup. Hyundai brought the fans there, and we gave some people in the favelas tickets to the World Cup final. Complete life-changing experience. And we saw from that, through the comments that we got through the videos, it's dead easy in digital to know whether you're doing it right or wrong. People tell you. Like, you know, people, it's like going out onto the street with a kick me sign on your back. You post something online, people will talk to you about it. And they came back, and the amount of people that said, thank you very much, Hyundai and Copper 90, this was amazing. So then Hyundai go, do you know what? We've just started really building authenticity and just started really building a relationship with the fans. They came to us really brave this year and said, we haven't got a tournament activation, we want to do something with you this year, because we want to carry on that conversation. So we asked our fans, what are the stories you wanted to tell? We're 5 parts into a 6-part series. We've told stories about FC United of Manchester, which was Breakaway Club in Manchester. Hackney Wick FC. Hackney's the only North East London borough that doesn't have a professional football team. There's a bunch of lads trying to sort one out there, which is great. Wednesday Night Warriors, women's street football. The real life story of Moneyball, which is the guy that's just bought Brentford FC, who's a football gambler. And the most recent film that went live a couple of days ago is about amputee football. Hyundai now have a reason to tell those stories because they've built an authenticity in being in football. They wouldn't have had if they just left the badging right last year and never touched football again. So I think the thing that is important is talking to the fans. Without them, everything is meaningless anyway.
The fans is a good point, because I think the first 2 sessions maybe gave rights holders a bit of a hard time as well. Maybe, you know, some fairly, maybe a little bit unfairly as well, because ultimately, you know, everyone's doing a good job and trying to, you know, get by in the world. So, but ultimately, you know, the fans are there and they still flock to football. So even if people do move off TV, it's not as though they're not going to be fans. So it's just kind of following that navigation of where they're going and making sure you still add value and you can still find them. So there's great opportunities for any rights holders, because those fans aren't going anywhere. They're still going to love what they love.
Well, it's perhaps understanding that it's not necessarily it's the push content model now, it's a push-pull, and if you get it right, you know, you've got people telling the story for you, saves you time and money, but it becomes more authentic. We talked about authenticity earlier on. And it keeps building that story. It involves people in that story and keeps them attracted into what you're doing rather than doing something else. And it gives them a sense of ownership, I guess. Would you agree with that, Jackie?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd probably argue, though, it's kind of beyond that, really. I think 5 years ago when we had this discussion about whether we've got pull marketing or push marketing or all of that stuff, you know, you don't have a choice. You know, even if the football club or even if the rights holder doesn't want to engage with it, you still have fans that are engaging with each other, and are talking about the brand and are talking about the experience. So it's happening irregardless of whether you're creating an arena for that to happen or not.
Yeah. We touched on data in the first couple of sessions very quickly. Do we see the emergence now of real-world retail, business intelligence, CRM mindsets and technologies coming into sport? Do we see in the sponsorship section of the business an opportunity to start segmenting sponsorship, moving away from logos and into a direct-to-customer, personalised, multi-deals in each category model?
Well, I mean, you kind of say Man U were almost the early adopters of that model already. They started it on a sort of regional level, so actually ironically using logos, but anyway. So they've been selling multiple categories over, so you know, they'll sell to a noodle company in Indonesia, then another one in China, and then a tire company in Thailand, and you know, whatever it may be. So they're kind of they were ahead of the game on that model, and that's probably almost becoming old now in itself. So clearly there's evidence that segmenting very narrowly can work, and absolutely yes, then sort of using CRM and data to do that is a very logical next step. So you need the right technology. I don't think a lot of clubs would admit that it's quite there yet in terms of they talk about having databases of fans, but how detailed and accurate that is questionable. Certainly if you want to start categorising sponsorships on that basis, but absolutely I think what you'll start to see now is partnerships with data companies who can add that value to the clubs. So United have
two
just
deals in the last week.
yes, United have done one with HLC, Chelsea I think with WinPro, and Man City have got one of SAP, and that's kind of the route they're now going in, where you partner with someone who's actually a real expert in that space. They can segment for you and then kind of ultimately add value to the club to then target their fans in different ways, and yet potentially really narrow down your rights and sell to very individual people.
It's probably just beyond the software as well, I'd argue. You know, you have to have the people in the business that have the vision, that have the vision that can then go in and sell that vision to the right brands. And if brands are going to be on one platform with another competing brand, they have to understand where the value is coming from. And I think internally, from a rights holder perspective, they don't often know, and so it's very difficult to sell, even when you've got the tools.
I used to talk about this a lot. So prior to joining Big Balls, I ran Spotify's commercial business in Europe for about 3.5 years. And in between those two, I used to speak at lots of events there. And in between those two, I did a lot of speaking at various events around music, technology and sport and various other things. And I used to talk a lot about data, because data is the hot thing at the moment, right? I think there's a real journey to go on with data, because a little bit of data is a very dangerous thing. And as you're going from a position of having no data to having tons of data, there is a journey that you take on that where you can make a ton of bad decisions going ahead for it. Do I think people need data? I also think data for data's sake is a waste of time. I think it's insight is what you really need. And so do brands and do clubs and do rights holders and all of those people need to have better insight into their audience? Absolutely. Does that lead them to a world where they can micro-segment what they're doing, and is that a valuable thing? I love the fact that almost every panel like this around the world talks about the Man United noodle model. It's like the big hot thing in the world of sports sponsorship at the moment. But it goes back to the same thing. If it means that you end up with 100 sponsorships that are that big, or 2 sponsorships that are that big, as long as you do them right, and there's a reason for doing them, and there's a value exchange and people understand it, great. If you go down the route of micro sponsorships and you do all of them badly, well then that's a waste of time.
Moving just back to the closer to the title of it, is official dead? Do you feel that sometimes as brands, being an official sponsor is often a crutch? Legislation such as things like the Olympic Act, for example, are used as a defensive mechanism, and it actually hinders creative activity. Going back to your point, Joel, about it's about the fans, it should be about adding value to their experience and enhancing that experience. Do we find that sometimes just being official is enough in the eyes of the brand, and actually they're leaving a whole bunch on the table, and it's actually sometimes turning the target audience off what they should be doing?
I think you know, with every per side, you know, how relevant and right official is for one point. And to answer the kind of question, sometimes official can be challenging because it can stop you being as nimble as your competitors. So one of the big examples of that is obviously there's a massive trend around real-time marketing now. So, for example, last night Wayne Rooney scored his 50th goal for England. Big moment. A lot of brands want to capitalise on that. I happen to work with a couple of brands who sponsor the England team, and clearly wanting to celebrate that achievement in real time on social is a big deal for them. Actually doing that as an official sponsor is kind of harder than it necessarily is if you're just a random brand who wants to talk about it, because if you're official, you've got to go to the rights holder, check what you want to tweet is going to be approved, get it out there, and get it out in real time. So one of the ways is obviously you pre-approve the tweets you want to send, and we do some things where we pre-approve the LED signage that is going to go around the stadium so it can link back to social. But if you wanted to do something even more reactive, it can be quite tough. So sometimes it may not even be that the brand is reluctant to do more than use their official rights, but it can be occasionally frustrating that it's actually hard to be as versatile as your competitors can be. But if you do it right, then you do have the inventory to make the message go a hell of a lot further. So if you can get it right, you have a reason for talking about it because you're involved. You have assets and inventory that bring it to life much more, so you can use imagery of Wayne Rooney or the England team, whatever it may be, and you have a load more distribution channels at your disposal as well. So the FA can use their channels to support you. So if you can do it, it can be incredibly effective, but you need to make sure you're kind of working with people who understand that reality and understand that to be more than just a badging exercise, the right sort of really needs to give you the tools to make it work properly.
Jackie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd agree, but I think it's around the flexibility of a rights holder and the negotiation of the deal. And I think when, again, going back to it, some of the big sporting properties are quite restricted. The Olympics are fairly restricted. Whereas if you're a brand and you want to work with those times, if you want to get the most out of your sponsorship, there's a lot of other properties out there that will allow you the flexibility to do that. I just got back yesterday from a music festival, and we don't have to pre-approve tweets. And the reason why that is because we've got a really strong relationship with the rights holder. We've already agreed content. We've looked at, so as it happens, so we were backstage with artists, and as it happens, we worked with the artists. We didn't have to actually sign anything off because we're working in partnership with the rights holder. And I think when you've got that kind of relationship, when it is more of a partnership rather than a badging exercise, you've got the flexibility, and then you've got everything that Joel said. You've got the right assets, you've got the history, you've got the rights owner that will then go and retweet it to all of their audience.
So the collaboration and trust is building value for all the stakeholders.
Yeah.
I think it depends what you're trying to do, doesn't it? So if you're clear on what your as a brand, if you're clear on what your objectives are, what you are trying to achieve through a official sponsorship, well, if being the official sponsor hits on those brilliantly, then great, fantastic. But if you want to be an official sponsor and you want to be a bit avant-garde and a bit provocative as well, then those two worlds really clash, and it's really difficult. And you might be lucky with music festivals, and you might, one or two might be okay, but being the official sponsor of the World Cup and then trying to do something really provocative on social media is probably not the right vehicle for you. But I think as long as it marries with what your objectives are, I think it's fine.
Okay, we've just got to take one last question before we break for lunch. We've seen a lot of disruption. We've talked about disruption again. We talked about music earlier on, video gaming's being very similar. We're seeing in other sectors the likes of Airbnb disrupting the hotel model or Uber, the taxi model. What do you think the sponsorship industry should be looking to take from those kinds of trends and lessons that we can learn and things that we can apply to make it an even more effective marketing medium?
I've quite big opinion on this one. I think it's probably not actually necessarily a responsibility of the sponsorship industry per se. I think there's a much bigger potential challenge coming around the broadcast environment, which obviously sponsors are part of. I think if you think about the environmental factors that allowed Uber to generate as a good example of a sort of challenger, ultimately it was people getting annoyed at spending 50 quid to go 9 miles in a black cab who wouldn't pick you up in the rain. So there are lots of reasons why Uber took off. In sports broadcasting, I think there's a storm brewing around in the UK around this battle between Sky and BT, where actually as a consumer now, you're coming to a point where it's impossible to get all the sports content you want via broadcast unless you buy both subscriptions, which I don't know about your household, but that's not being signed off in mine. So, and then I think some people can't even afford one or the other. So you're in that situation. So in that world, I think consumers are going to get more and more frustrated by having to where they go for live broadcast, And ultimately, that kind of frustration is what breeds the actual sort of from the bottom up rebellion against that to find other ways of finding live content. And it's been done before and there's various sites, but I think that's probably a real tension point. So therefore, if you're a sponsor, there's lots of interesting areas around that in terms of how you getting your brand out there if people aren't going to the traditional places to do it because they're so frustrated by this sort of segmentation of live and access to sport. So it's a big question, I think.
So we could see some disruption there first. Well, we see it now TV and
yeah, I mean, I'm for my sins a Reading fan, and the other day I had to go on Twitter to watch a video on Vine of someone recording their TV to see a goal, and that can't be a sustainable long-term model.
if that's how people are watching it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jackie, what do you think? You do a lot of work in music.
Well, I think from an industry perspective, sponsorship is, pretty traditional, and it's been going for 20 years pretty much the same way. And to Chris's point, if you want to do real-time marketing, if you want to do something avant-garde, you can't touch rugby, you can't touch Olympics. And actually, for me, I think, why not? Why shouldn't you be able to? Why can't you work in the Olympics and also do forward-thinking marketing? And the fact that so many of the traditional platforms out there keep everything in the way that it's been going for 20 years is actually what's stalling it, stalling the potential of the growth of what brands can do, of what rights holders can do. And so for me, I think if that shifted a bit or was hugely disruptive, that would be a positive thing. But it doesn't need to if brands continue to play in their playground, basically.
I think Airbnb, Uber, Google, Facebook, Spotify, any of these disruptive businesses that have gone in and really fundamentally shifted a market one way or another, iTunes before Spotify, all came at it, and all as businesses all continue to come at it from the perspective of the customer, the consumer.
Yeah.
They either fulfilled a demand that was in the market already, or they created a demand that no one knew you could do through technology. So do I think the world of official or rights sponsorship in the world of sport is always thinking about the end user and the end result and the reason for being here? Probably not. I suspect some people do, and I suspect some people don't. I think some brands are better at it than others, like in every walk of life. But I'm not sure a big technology company is going to come in and disrupt sports sponsorships. I'm not sure what that vehicle was. I certainly haven't thought of it myself, and if I could, I probably would. But I think fundamentally, unless you are always thinking about the impact you're making on the end user, that's the only way to drive your business forward. And without that, everything else is a waste of time.
I think because of the value of TV rights now in sport, I think the only disruptive force could potentially be is the YouTubes, Googles of the world, if they decide they want to become a live broadcaster, because they're really the only ones with the cash reserves.
I mean, I don't
who can compete.
I'm not that close to Larry and Sergey. We've had dinner a couple of times.
Yeah.
I'm not very close, but like if Google wanted to hold all of the live broadcasts for all of the sports in all of the world, they could do it tomorrow. Like they've got enough cash. Apple could.
They don't want to pay a rights fee.
Apple could. It's just not their business. They're not.
Yeah.
And at some point they might do. I think what's really interesting is the world that's going on around originated content on those platforms as well. And Apple TV are going to come in and start creating loads of content. You've got Amazon, you've got Netflix, you've got other over-the-top platforms. Hey, listen, BT Sport didn't exist, 5-6 years ago, and they came in and they're having a real go at it. So I think the vehicle by which you might watch live sport, it could easily be disrupted. But yeah, I think unless you think about the end consumer, I think you're in a tough place.
Couldn't agree more. Just before we break, we got any questions for the panel? Probably everyone's quite hungry. One over here.
Very interesting chat, and actually touched upon a question I wanted to ask at the end of the last forum about connectivity, which the lady mentioned about official rights and partnering up with a brand involves bureaucracy, red tape, and speed, which the quicker you can connect at the grassroots is the way forward. And like the gentleman said, the Googles of this world, the Facebooks, the Twitters, might be redundant to a certain degree in 5 years' time with some of the new platforms coming on board. But they are a very good vehicle for brands and venues to connect directly with the end user, the fan. And sometimes official rights is about controlling the message, because that's about the sponsorship. And you might have already lost it. You might already be too late. By the time marketing departments and sponsorship departments decide what they need to do. The message is already out there. People have made their mind up. They know what they're doing. So to a certain extent, official sponsorship partnerships could be dead in the traditional sense. It's about controlling the message, and the message is out there. It's connecting as quick as you can using a platform like Facebook or other platforms with the end users, who are the kids of tomorrow, the youngsters growing up. I think that's quite critical. So the lazy shirt sponsorship or the easy big ticket item might be dead in terms of getting the message across. Connecting is the critical thing.
I think to that point, I wouldn't want anyone to leave this panel thinking anything that is traditional, shirt sponsor, stadium sponsor, is a terrible thing. You've got to do really smart, clever little things online. My philosophy is, and I think you're right, the world is so connected now, you just can't operate in a vacuum. My philosophy is still the same as it has been for 25 years in and around this business, which is, if you're going to do something, do it right and do it well. And if that means using other devices, other platforms to amplify what you're doing, speak about what you're doing, create a reason to do it, great. I don't think the world of traditional sponsorship is going to die and everyone's going to be doing really cool stuff online. I think there's a world for both of them, but you just got to do it properly and do it well.
Thank you. Any more quick question at the back? Thank you. Thank you. Can you tell us who you are, sorry, before you...
My name is João. I'm here with CIS, the FIFA Marshall people. I'm a consultant in Switzerland. The panelists mentioned a few times some of these disruptive new technologies, mentioned many of them. I'm particularly curious about quite a new one, which is Meerkat, Periscope. If that's the next disruptive one, and if you're already taking that into account. For instance, Joe, when you work with sponsors at Octagon, do you already consider that? Are there strategies to exploit that? Thank you.
I think that's a very good question. I think back to Joel's example of watching Reading through about 3 different devices. You know, when we have ubiquity of high-density Wi-Fi and everyone has got a live streaming app on their phone, that's going to be a real problem, I think. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think at the moment you're already seeing some rights holders embrace the Meerkats and the Periscopes in the right way, which is added value for fans. So, you know, really nice little ones like the Australian Rugby Union and also the New Zealand Rugby have done nice things around training and dressing rooms and kind of, so giving you kind of live feeds via Meerkat, via Periscope into those kind of behind the scene environments, which are real added value moments. And as a fan, that's actually bringing more to the experience, the rights holders controlling it. And you know, you can obviously give it to brands as well to partner with if you want. So that's a really nice way of doing it. Clearly, the doomsday scenario with that technology is having 1,000 fans in a stadium just holding the phone up and doing it. But I think most of the counter arguments to that will be ultimately, you know, as a consumer, as a fan, whether you're watching it on BT Sport, Google, on your box, on net, whatever the platform is that delivers it to you, that the premium delivery is still very important. So the way that consumers moan when Channel 5 do bad coverage of the Football League show, or you know, people miss the way Sky Sports produce football or rugby, people still want that premium experience as a viewer. So, you know, intelligent insight, commentating, etc., etc. If you have the choice between that and, you know, some guy with some person swearing next to them filming on a mobile, even if it is in, you know, 4K on a 4K phone, it's still not actually the content you want. So I think those things are more about enhancing the overall access fans have to the sporting environment rather than being a replacement for actually really good production of sporting theatre.
And I think done well, brands and rights holders will embrace that and use it as part of their overall offering. I'm with you. I don't think 7 million people are going to sit in front of a computer at any point in time watching a live stream Periscope of an international or an Arsenal match. I think that's a very odd world and one that I hope I'm not part of. But and I think also if brands and federations and clubs and rights holders try and, you know, ban all of that sort of activity, then they're going to lose out as well, because we've seen, you know, water finds a way of rolling downhill whatever you put in front of it. So so that's in existence. I think those brands and rights holders that embrace it, you know, if I was a brand, I would create a place where you would upload all of your Periscope Meerkat stuff so that you're sort of working in conjunction with the brand or the club or the confederation.
Yeah.
I think that's smart as well. These technologies, you know, again, I used the phrase before, you know, the genie's out of the bag now. No one's putting that. Genie's out of the bag? That's not the right.
The cat's
Genie-
out of the bag.
Cat's out of the bag, and
the
he called the
genie's out of the
genie who just got out of the
bottle.
bottle. You know, no one's going to put that genie back in the bottle now, so you've got to embrace it because it's there.
Yeah. And again, the MLB are doing that in the US. There you
Okay,
go.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
so they're partnering with Snapchat, so it's a non-commercial deal.
Yeah.
So they're not making any money from Snapchat. Snapchat aren't really making any money back, but essentially they know that the MLB, so this is baseball, fundamental issue with youth audiences. So it's a slightly more traditional game, older audience. Snapchat is clearly the most youth-friendly at the moment, and will be replaced by tomorrow, I'm sure, with another platform. But at the moment, it's the one the kids are using more than any other. And so they're essentially just allowing Snapchat to run MLB content via the platform. So it can be stuff, you know, it can be people filming stuff at the match, you know. And rather than saying, oh my God, that's live content and broadcast, you know, how dare you, let's ban you, and that's piracy, they're kind of saying, you know what, it's a 10-second clip on a 16-year-old's phone that he shares with 15 people, and he uses our IP,
And it's
Fine.
And it's marketing.
and it's just pushing our brand actually to a new audience. It's not cannibalizing Fox's broadcast, and so
Exactly.
that's, I think, you know, the key.
Rather than trying to cut the head off the Hydra.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Jack.
Thank you for that question. Do we have anything else from the floor? I'm fairly sure you're all looking forward to a pie and something else for lunch. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I'd just like to say thank you again to Chris, to Jackie, and to Joel. For those of you that are not already ESSA members, we'd love to hear more from you and have you join our sponsorship family. Have a look at sponsorship.org. And again, if you'd like to find out more about the ESSA Summit, you don't have to be a member to come along, but I think it'll be a fantastic day. We have a keynote speech by Tom Fishburne from Marketunis.com, who I think will be a terrific keynote. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.